This podcast explores themes of murder and rape. Listener discretion is advised. The words of Jeffrey Dahmer are voiced by an actor.
Not only was the deceased dismembered, but then the bones were broken apart with a sledgehammer.
Dahmer is serving 15 consecutive life sentences for the murders of 17 males.
The most prolific slayer in the history of the state of Wisconsin.
From 1978 to 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer murdered 17 men and boys, attempted to kill at least 2 others, and attacked, drugged, and abused countless more. He cannibalized some of his victims, dismembered their bodies, preyed on the vulnerable, and took advantage of pre-existing stigma to become one of the most depraved serial killers in American history. But what's the real story of this most unlikely of killers? Over the course of 6 episodes, we'll speak to detectives, journalists, survivors, and witnesses to dive deep into the case of Jeffrey Dahmer, tracking his trajectory as a killer and exposing the many opportunities that were lost to prevent his reign of terror. And ultimately asking, could this ever happen again? I'm criminal psychologist Dr. Michelle Ward, and this is Season 4 of Mind of a Monster, Jeffrey Dahmer. Episode 1, First Kill. It's June 18th, 1978, and we're in Bath Township, Ohio. Here, within a large ranch-style house, 2 young men are drinking beers. One of them, a handsome, long-haired 18-year-old named Stephen Hicks, is on his way to a rock concert. This isn't his house. It belongs to Jeff, the hospitable stranger he's drinking with and who had offered him a ride earlier that day. But it's getting late now and Hicks needs to leave. He thanks his companion Jeff and attempts to say goodbye. But something inside Jeff snaps. He doesn't want Stephen Hicks to leave. Jeff grabs a barbell and with all his strength, whacks it hard over the back of Stephen Hicks' head. Then, using the same barbell, he strangles the life out of Hicks' young body. You see, the host is Jeffrey Dahmer, and this is his first kill. To understand how we get to this point, we need to go back to the beginning, to Dahmer's childhood and teenage years.
As a very young boy, he was very happy, and he would run to me and jump into my arms. And he loved his grandparents, my mother and father, and just was a very happy little boy.
You're listening to the voice of Jeffrey Dahmer's father, Lionel, who spoke to the Mind of a Monster team in 2020. He and his then-wife, Joyce, welcomed baby Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer into the world in May 1960 and moved to Bath, Ohio several years later.
When he was very little, we had a very close relationship. He wanted to be held and would come running up to me whenever I'd come home. He just loved to be with me and his mother.
With violent offenders, it's tempting to sift through their childhood for an aha moment, an incident that serves as a key to unlock the secret of their violent trajectory. With Jeffrey Dahmer, this is incredibly difficult. Despite some tensions at home, which we will come to, his life is not so different to most. In fact, it's one of relative privilege. He lives in a lovely family home in a picturesque white-collar town and attends good schools. His father is a scientist and his mother is a teletype machine instructor. She suffers from depression and is medicated with some episodes of mental ill health, all of which can be troubling for a child. But as far as we know, Jeffrey is not abused and does not suffer neglect at a young age. The only incident of note during his very early years is a double hernia operation, which must have been painful, but lots of kids have operations. I want to know what his classmates thought of him, so I speak with Mike Kukral, who was the same year as Dahmer in high school.
You know, it's funny because if you don't talk about him, then people will make up stories about you and Jeff Dahmer. So it's better to talk about him and tell the truth because I just knew him in high school And that was it. And people are always saying things like, well, he was best friends with Jeff Dahmer and they hung around all the time. And I'm like, no, that didn't happen. Last time I saw him was high school. And I don't think he had any best friends, actually, but we all knew him. But yeah, so I always tell people about it before they make up stories.
I can see why you want to get in front of that and make sure that you're the one telling the story first. Please explain to me how you first met Jeffrey Dahmer.
I met Jeffrey Dahmer when we were all thrown into junior high school together. So I didn't know him until 7th grade, but everyone went to the same junior high and high school. And you were thrown in and had to meet all these new people, and Jeff Dahmer was just one of those.
What was your impression of him when you first met him?
That's a good question. I don't know if anybody has first impressions when they're in 7th grade. People ask me, was he strange? And I say everybody in 7th grade was strange. But, when I think back to 7th grade and Jeff Dahmer, he was sort of quiet from what I remember in that time, but he was always a nice kid. And he liked to read like fantasy books. I remember him reading Dune, which was a really challenging book to read. And I remember talking to him about that, what's that book about? And he was just sort of goofy and didn't give it any serious answers. But, I had classes with him. He was in biology class with me. He was in gym class with me. And I just remember him as one of the kids, not somebody that I became close friends with at all, but one of the kids that was like, okay, but, a little quiet and always seemed to be off doing something sort of on his own a little bit. I think he had some friends. He played in the band too. He played trumpet in the band. He played tennis. He was on the tennis team actually. And so, he did things that I did as well. And he lived right across the street from some of my really better friends.
By the time Dahmer is in his teens, home life has become hard. His father works a lot and his mother's depression is worsening. The pressure on his parents' relationship has gotten to a breaking point and divorce is now on the horizon. Yet, both parents continue to care for their children, and Lionel is keen for his son to cultivate an interest in science, often taking Jeffrey with him to work.
I took him to the lab with me and showed him how litmus paper changes color with acids and bases, which all of us know. And he wasn't that extremely interested in it, but he listened and he seemed to enjoy what I was telling him. I was able to give Jeff some knowledge of chemistry, I thought, and he liked walking over to the lab with me,
But it's not chemistry the young boy is interested in. That would come later. It's biology. He frequently collects roadkill to dissect and examine. Anyone with even a passing interest in crime and psychology will know that cruelty to animals can be an early red flag with violent offenders. But it doesn't seem as though Dahmer is killing these creatures. He's collecting them once they're already dead. In fact, Jeffrey Dahmer would later speak extensively about his life and crimes, making a point of saying as much. The words you are about to hear are Jeffrey Dahmer's, spoken by an actor.
I never killed animals. Never did that. I always used dead ones just for experimentation.
The young boy might not be harming the animals while they're alive, but there are hints that his interest in their dead anatomy is going well beyond what would be expected.
I don't think there were any really red flags, except for if indeed he was doing something sexual while he was feeling the insides of these roadkill animals.
Did you ever hear any disturbing stories or anything that stood out for you about him?
Well, when I was, I think in maybe, I'm going to say 9th grade, we took biology class and Dahmer was in the class. And one of the things we had to do was dissect a fetal pig. There were several of them for the class to use. You worked on it in teams. And somebody stole one of the fetal pigs when the teacher counted up one of them as missing. And that was big news in the school because that's not something you did. You didn't steal things out of a classroom. You didn't steal a fetal pig. And the principal got on the loudspeaker, the intercom, every morning for a long time and talked about that. Now, whoever stole that fetal pig, just bring it back and no questions asked this time. And then it got more threatening and more threatening. When we find you, whoever stole that pig, you're in big trouble. So it went on a long time. And when you're 14 or 15 years old, that's a very funny thing to happen. And we just would laugh and laugh and laugh about that. I wonder who stole it. And we had our guesses, but and then you move on to something else and you forget about it. And here it is all these years later. I'm watching an interview with Jeffrey Dahmer, and he's talking about high school, and he was the one who stole the fetal pig. Jeff Dahmer stole it. Of course, it was Jeff Dahmer.
Do you think this is part of his humor, to do things like steal a pig?
He learned that he could get away with stuff maybe when he did that.
Stories about Dahmer's jokes and pranks come thick and fast from those who knew him as a child and teenager. From pretending to have seizures in a shopping mall to tormenting the school librarian. The general impression is of a boy who's quiet, awkward, on the fringes of friendship groups, and who can get away with often very bizarre practical jokes. He strikes me as a teenager who's desperate for validation and acknowledgement, but disrespectful of authority and unfearful of consequence.
He had a funny sense of humor. He made us laugh a lot. And it wasn't telling jokes or anything. It was more about imitating people and acting crazy. And some of that was like in junior high, but I think more of it played out in high school. And probably what was pretty funny to most of us is that he got into photographs in the high school yearbook, group photographs, in groups that he was not a member. And the best known, of course, is the National Honor Society. And he's right in the middle of the group photograph, but his head is blacked out, so you can't see any head there. It's this blacked out photo. And in retrospective, that's pretty creepy to look at now.
Was he smart?
Oh, was Jeff Dahmer smart? I'd say he was a very intelligent guy. He had a lot of brains to him, that he did well in junior high, and he liked science, and he did pretty well as far as I know. And I think something changed, though, by the end of high school, and he wasn't interested in school anymore, and I know he wasn't attending classes anymore regularly, but I think he's a very smart guy, and I think that's one of the reasons he got away with the things he did for so long.
One of the reasons he fails to engage with school as he used to is a growing dependency on alcohol. His father, Lionel, becomes increasingly concerned.
He had several good friends that he knew well, and one of the friends had alcoholic beverages their parents had in the home. Unfortunately, Jeff got started drinking too much. And we told the teachers and other students, too, that something should be done about it, but nothing was done about the alcoholic situation.
Mike, tell us about Jeffrey Dahmer's drinking.
We noticed that he was, acting different, not coming to class, failing classes, hanging out in the parking lot all day. I really don't remember him a whole lot from our senior year. He sort of started to drift away and go somewhere else physically and mentally as well. I remember he didn't come to German class, and he was standing in the hallway, and he kept putting his face right on the window of the classroom, the little window, like 8x10 window, and pushing his face up against it. And we could all see him, but the German teacher couldn't because she's facing us. And he was failing classes, and we knew that. So I did see a shift, because I'd say from junior high, he was a good student, got through everything, did well in classes. And by the end of our senior year, though, he was moving into his own world and had gone somewhere else mentally. And part of that was his connection to drinking, and part of that was what was going on in his brain that we had no idea.
It's during his senior year that divorce proceedings between his parents begin. Annie Schwartz is the author of Monster, the true story of the Jeffrey Dahmer murders, and was a young journalist in the 1990s covering Jeffrey Dahmer's case. She believes the divorce hit Dahmer exceptionally hard.
When talking about the fact that Jeffrey Dahmer was a product of divorced parents, which we used to call back in the time when this happened, a broken home, I mean, just think of the ways we talked about those kinds of things. His parents just didn't divorce, all right? His father moved out, and Joyce was leaving Jeffrey alone for prolonged periods of time in the house when he's in high school. He's drinking. So is he drinking because of the age-old reason that people become alcoholics because they are escaping? They want not to be in touch with the real world. They don't feel like they're enough. I'm not qualified to make that observation, but I can tell you that when we talk about those building blocks of this case and the killer that is Jeffrey Dahmer, we started with a mother who was depressed and anxious. The parents are fighting. We're putting all of that together, almost like a timeline. So did his parents' divorce affect him? Sure.
Lionel Dahmer describes in vivid detail the impact of the impending divorce on his son.
When I talked to Jeff about the divorce, he went out and started slapping trees with a branch. I think the divorce had an effect of ripping away any amount of control over life that he could have had. I think it just depleted him completely of control of his existence. He didn't know what to do.
I want you to take note of the word control, because Dahmer's need for control is an incredibly important motif throughout the story. One area of his life he has no control over is his sexuality. He's known he's gay since his early teens, but to be gay in the 1970s is no picnic. Discrimination means that many keep the truth of their sexuality secret, and teenage Jeffrey Dahmer is no exception.
I knew what my orientation was around 13. It just seemed to be the way things were. I had friends and everything, but the important issues I kept to myself. The first encounter I had with anyone was the kid across the street. We were both about the same age. It was consensual in a fort. That was really the first time, but it was just very light sex, kissing, holding, that type of thing. I was 14. I think he was 14, something like that. It was consensual.
It's more than possible that part of the reason he's drinking so much is because of his struggles with his sexuality. Acceptance in the 1970s is a million miles away from what it is today. It's only in 1973 that homosexuality is removed as a mental disorder by the American Psychiatric Association. Homophobic discrimination is still legally acceptable, and his parents' eventual divorce takes place just weeks before the assassination of Harvey Milk. But Jeffrey Dahmer's awakening desires quickly take a disturbing twist. What his parents and high school classmates do not know is the troubled class joker has been cultivating some incredibly dark fantasies. Fantasies of engaging in sexual activity with a dead male body.
I have no idea why I started getting the fantasies and thoughts. When I was about 16, that's when it started kicking in.
It is a desire that we label necrophilia. Dr. Fred Berlin is a world-renowned authority on deviant sexual behavior and would go on to spend hours interviewing and assessing Jeffrey Dahmer. I want to draw on his expertise to get to the bottom of these disturbing fantasies. From your perspective, what do you think was driving those particular sexual fantasies? Because most of us are not turned on by corpses.
Well, that's something that we really don't talk much about and are trying to learn more about, which is why do any of us experience the sexual desires that we do? In studying that, we can look at nature or nurture, but perhaps one of the most important points for people to understand is that we don't experience the particular desires that we have because of some choice that we've made. In other words, when I was a little boy, I didn't sit down and say, do I want to grow up to be attracted to women? If I'm going to experience attractions to corpses, it's not because I'm a bad little kid who weighs my options and decides this is what's going to turn me on. in growing up, I discover that that's the nature of my sexual makeup, and then I have to cope in the world from a very different perspective. And if I may, why that's so important right at this moment is, as we're speaking, there's numbers of 16, 17-year-old youngsters out there privately aware of the fact that they're experiencing frightening, unacceptable, problematic sorts of sexual attractions, cravings, feelings. And because of the stigma that our society attaches to that, the last thing they're going to do is raise their hand and come and ask for help. They're not even going to tell their best friend or their family about that.
No, they're not going to risk being ostracized.
Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that we should be accepting of the kind of behavior Mr. Dahmer engaged in, but what I am suggesting is that a young, troubled adolescent who's experiencing these kinds of feelings needs to be able to come forward and get help.
I agree with you, with zero equivocation. The only way that one can actually address somebody's homicidal urges or necrophilia urges is if there is a safe place for them to seek treatment. But for Jeffrey Dahmer, there was no such safe place. Can we reflect back on his childhood a little bit? Were there any potential red flags that you saw that rose to the surface for you?
Well, really what surprised me was how, in so many ways, his childhood was fairly normal. Now, in retrospect, one could look back. There was a time when he had an interest in taxidermy. So you look back and say, my goodness, maybe that should have been a red flag. But how many young people have an interest in taxidermy who don't end up to be serial killers and don't end up having necrophilia? So had I met Mr. Dahmer during his childhood, and assuming that he wasn't going to be in a position to talk about the privacy of what he was experiencing sexually, I don't think I would have seen many red flags as to where he was heading.
And how could anyone have known where he was heading? There's a risk in cases like Jeffrey Dahmer's of judging it with hindsight, when in reality there was no way for those around him to predict the path he would take. When we hear hooves, we think horses, not zebras. And Dahmer is secretive, very, very secretive. By the time he reaches his senior year, something in his psyche is changed forever. He's been coveting the body of a handsome young jogger he sees often in his neighborhood. He has become active and alert to the possibility of having him. Jeffrey Dahmer is a predator in waiting.
Hey, true crime fans, it's Mark Maron. We all want to get to the bottom of things. You want to figure out mysterious cases. I want to figure out people. On WTF with Mark Maron, I bring famous folks to my garage for conversations you won't hear anywhere else. Listen to WTF wherever you get podcasts, or even better, subscribe to WTF Plus to get every episode ad-free and weekly bonus content. For a free month of WTF Plus, head to go.acast.com/WTF and use the code GARAGE.
As graduation approaches, Dahmer's interest in death and the inner workings of the male body spill into the real world. Mike Kukral recalls a chilling incident in the school hallway.
Now, I think this is at Revere at the high school, and the hallways are crowded between classes, like always, lots of people walking up and down the hallway, and I'm standing there by my locker, and Jeff Dahmer comes walking down the hallway. I don't think anything of that. I don't even see him probably. But he just sort of leans over real quick and puts his head on my chest for like 5 seconds. I said, I want to listen to your heart. And then he was gone. And that was it. And that was part of his sense of humor. I mean, at the time you just thought, that's goofy Jeff. That's quirky Jeff Dahmer. There's nothing evil or sick about that.
It takes on a whole different meaning now that you know what you know about Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer's mind is far away from his classmates and grades. Increasingly left to his own devices, his thoughts are still fixed on the jogger. Annie Schwartz.
This was a muscular young man, kind of thin, athletic, and he's attracted to that. So he is obsessed with this jogger. He plans to try and figure out how can he get that jogger? How can he meet him? How can he live out his fantasy with him? What can he do?
He takes a baseball bat out with him one day and lies in wait for the jogger to come. This teenage boy is a toxic mix of hormones, adrenaline, and disturbing desire. The jogger doesn't show. It's a week or so after graduation, and we're back at the Dahmers' family home, but there is nothing homey about it. The cupboards are bare, and the place is a mess. Joyce Dahmer has moved out permanently, and Lionel Dahmer is living in a motel. Without the routine of high school or the presence of his parents, Jeffrey Dahmer is home alone most of the time, with only his dark fantasies about male bodies, like that of the joggers, to occupy his mind. I return to Dr. Fred Berlin. Of course, having absent parents must be upsetting, but there is such a tendency for all of us to go back to the childhood and teenage years and search for that one moment to make it make sense.
Yeah, and we like to think there's a life story that helps us understand it. That was kind of the way the Freudian psychiatry of the 1950s was, that we can figure out what went wrong during early psychological maturation and development. Having developed that insight and the emotional release, the problem is somehow magically solved. It doesn't usually work that way. Now, there are situations such as people who tend to have what we call antisocial personality disorder, where we see behavioral problems early on and then the pattern just continues. But there's nothing of that sort that was present in the case of Mr. Dahmer.
No, that's right. And I get very frustrated when I see people try to create trauma where there was no trauma. People talk about divorce a lot. Well, we'd have half of our kids running around killing people if truly it had that level of impact.
Yeah, again, in the history of psychiatry, tragically, of blaming parents, we used to talk about a schizophrenogenic mother. Bad mothering has nothing to do with developing schizophrenia. So we really have to get away from these stories that in a way sometimes comfort us because we think we understand, and admit there's a lot that we don't know. And we don't know why people develop the particular sexual cravings they do. We need to do more research on that, and we need to be open to the idea there's a spectrum of human sexuality, and where it's causing problems, be able to address it and prevent it.
It's an excellent point. And when we can open up the dialogue and open up the research, we will have fewer victims if, as you say, there is a place to actually seek that help. But all of that being said, what the divorce did do was create an environmental situation for Jeffrey Dahmer where he's home alone.
Being alone allowed for much more time for him to just be preoccupied with his fantasies and urges, to be in a situation where there wasn't any supervision.
Once I had the opportunity and a place where I could actually make these fantasies come true, then trying to hold them back was just seemed to be too much. Desire grew and grew more constant, stronger. Thoughts of a good-looking, well-built guy having total control over him. I don't know if killing ever came into play, but if that was the only way to keep him, then that would be done.
Not long after graduation, Mike Kukrold bumps into Jeffrey Dahmer.
When we graduated in June of '78, we had a party maybe a week after graduation, and it was a party out on a farm, and there were a couple kegs of beer there. And for a lot of us, it was the first time we drank a bunch of beer. Maybe there was a bonfire, and it was a pretty nice setting, and everybody had fun and got along really well. And I was driving home that night, and it wasn't super late, but it was summer, we graduated, and it was probably 1 a.m. I was driving home and sort of a back road, and I see somebody walking on the road, and this is a road where there's no lights, it's mostly woods, and there's not a lot of houses, and it's Jeff Dahmer. And that's not surprising to see people after a party sometimes, trying to get home. And so I obviously pulled over, hey, you want to ride? And he doesn't say anything. He just gets in the car. And I could tell he had a lot to drink. And I drove him to his house a couple miles away on my way home and pulled in his driveway. And I asked him a couple things like, hey, what are you doing this fall? And what's going on this summer? Are you working? And I don't remember any answers from him. I don't remember him being very talkative. And I thought, okay, he's had a lot to drink, I guess, a lot of beer. And I noticed his house was really dark. But the thing was, it was late at night, so I just assumed everybody was asleep in his house. Later, I would learn, no, the utilities were off and he was living there alone. And I didn't know that. And so I said bye to him, see you later. He got out of my car and went in his house that June of 1978, and I never saw him again.
By now, the craving to have a submissive male body is all-consuming. Then, on the fateful day of June 18th, 1978, Jeffrey Dahmer is driving alone when he notices a young man on the road. He's shirtless and wearing jeans and tennis shoes.
I had the car about 5 o'clock at night, and I was driving back home after drinking. I wasn't looking for anyone, but about a mile away from the house, there he was, hitchhiking along the road. He was attractive. I was attracted to him. I stopped and thought, well, should I pick him up or not? And I asked him if he wanted to go back and smoke some pot, and he said, oh yeah.
The attractive man is Stephen Hicks. He has also just graduated from high school and is hitching a ride to a rock concert at Chippewa Lake Park. He gets into the car and the pair drive off toward Dahmer's house. It is the last journey Stephen Hicks will ever make, alive. I return to Dr. Fred Berlin. Can you describe what happened to Stephen Hicks?
Mr. Dahmer, from sort of his early teenage years, if not before that, was aware of having these strong urges to have sex with a dead body. In fact, he was virtually impotent with people while they were alive. It's just that he hadn't yet reached a point of acting on that. And so the fuse had already been lit. In other words, he was predisposed. He was like the trigger that was ready to be pulled. And then the circumstances come together where he picks up this hitchhiker. It appears that Mr. Hicks went with him completely voluntarily.
And we went into my bedroom, had some beer. And from the time I spent with him, I could tell he wasn't gay. I didn't know how to keep him there, other than to get the barbell and to hit him with it over the head. And strangled him with the same barbell.
And that, of course, was the first time that he'd committed a murder. But it was inevitable in my mind that at some point that killing was going to occur, because all of the preceding parts of his life, all of the preceding development of his sexuality, the pieces were already in place.
Now, 18-year-old Jeffrey Dahmer is in a situation he's always fantasized about. He's alone with a dead body. Like the countless animals he's experimented with before, Dahmer cuts the body up, hacking, slicing, and carving with a knife.
The first time, I didn't know how to dispose of the remains, and so, but once I started doing it, it became sexually exciting to me. A frantic attempt to undo what I'd gotten myself into. Took the head, washed it off, put it on the bathroom floor, masturbated and all that, then put the head back down with the rest of the bags.
Can you explain the reasons for the dismemberment, psychologically speaking?
A couple of reasons. One, he was, and this is gruesome, turned on by observing internal anatomy. So the dismembering was part of wanting to dissect the bodies and tied into the kind of sexual excitement that he got from doing that. The dismembering was also done because in many cases he had to have a way of disposing of the bodies, and therefore by dismembering them, he could get them in the garbage bag or something and dispose of them.
After a day or so, he stuffs the dismembered body into 2 trash bags, which he puts in the back seat of his car. He has a vague plan to drive across the state and get rid of the bags in a dumping site. I return to Annie Schwartz. What happens next?
Dahmer gets stopped by a police officer who says, what's going on? Where are you going? What are you doing? But the master manipulator tells the police no, you know what? I just have to get to the dump. I've got trash. I gotta, And do we expect that officer is going to say, I wonder if he has a dead body in the car?
They asked me, what's this stuff? And I said it's just garbage that I hadn't gotten around to drop off at the city dump earlier today. I thought they were going to look into them. They could smell them. Both of them.
What the police officer could never have known is that the nervous young man before him would go on to become one of the most depraved serial killers in American history. And right at that moment, he's within the officer's grasp. The officer gets Dahmer to walk in a straight line to test his sobriety. Surely he'll check the trash bags as well. In the next episode, we follow as Jeffrey Dahmer's trajectory takes a surprising turn. Mind of a Monster, Jeffrey Dahmer is produced by Arrow Media for ID. The executive producer for ID is Jessica Lowther. Arrow Media's producer is Rebecca Radil. Editor, Sirkin Nihat. Audio engineering by Mahoney Audio Post. Our line producer is Philippa Whittle. Our junior production manager is Jody Tanner Wild. Our production coordinator is Shannon Tunicliffe. And our assistant producer is Isabel Wilson. Our archive producer is Katia Lohm. Arrow Media's series producer is Gabrielle Nash, and executive producer is Stuart Pender. Jeffrey Dahmer is played by Andrew Groon. I'm your host, Dr. Michelle Ward. You can follow our show wherever you get your podcasts, and we'd love it if you could take a second to leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Want even more true crime? Discovery Plus has more hours of true crime content than any other streaming platform. Go to discoveryplus.com/Mind of a Monster to start your free trial today. That's discoveryplus.com/Mind of a Monster.